Cervantes,
All right.
Shin, Connolly, Daly, Davies, Dixon, Isali, Flora, Mike Fong, Vince Fong, Friedman, Gabriel, Gallagher, Garcia, Gibson, Grayson, Haney, Hart, Holden, Hoover, Irwin, Jackson, Jones Sawyer, Cara, Lackey, Lee, Lowe, Lowenthal, Mainshine, Mathis, McCarty, McKinner, Mersucci, Quinn, Ortega, Pacheco, Papin, Jim Patterson, Joe Patterson, Pellerin, Petrie Norris, Quirk Silva, Ramos, Rendon, Reyes, Luz Rivas, Rodriguez, Rubio, Sanchez, Santiago, Chiavo, Soria, Ta, Ting, Valencia, Viapudua, Waldron, Wallace, Ward, Weber, Wicks, Wilson, Wood, Zabur, Mr. Speaker.
Members, a quorum is present. We ask our guests and visitors in the rear of the chamber and in the gallery to please stand for the prayer and the flag salute. In honor of today's Black History Month ceremony, Assemblymember Wilson will offer the prayer.
God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. The path where we share our bread with the hungry, where we bring to our house the poor who are cast out, where we extend our soul to satisfy the afflicted soul. Lord, may you guide us continually and satisfy our soul in drought and strengthen our bones. Let us be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Because of you, we shall build the old waste places. We shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and we shall be called the repairer of the breach. In the name above all names, amen.
Thank you, Assemblymember Wilson. Assemblymember McCarty will lead us in the pledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please join me in the pledge as we honor Black History Month Unsung Heroes. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. Reading of the previous day's journal.
Assembly Chamber, Sacramento, Friday, January 12th,
Ms. Aguilar
2024.
Curry moves. Mr. Flora seconds that the reading of the previous day's journal be dispensed with. Presentations and petitions, there are none. Introduction and reference of bills will be deferred. Reports of committee will be deemed read and amendments deemed adopted. Messages from the governor, there are none. Messages from the Senate, there are none. Moving to motions and resolutions, the absences for the day. For legislative business, Assemblymember Juan Carrillo. For medical leave, Assemblymember Dolly. For illness, Assemblymember Berman and Cervantes. Majority Leader Aguilar Curry, you are recognized for your procedural motions.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent to suspend Assembly Rule 45.5 to allow Assembly members Quirk Silva, Berner, and Dixon to speak on adjournments in memory today.
Without objection, such shall be the order.
I request unanimous consent to suspend Assembly Rule 118 to allow Assembly Member Wilson to have guests on the floor today.
Without objection, such shall be the order.
I am giving a one-day notice to remove file item A-18 SB 479 Padilla from the inactive file at the request of Assembly Member McKinnon.
Clerk will know. Members with us today, there are several staff from the Center for Legislative Strengthening, which is a unit of the National Conference of State Legislatures. The center focuses its work on bolstering the autonomy and effectiveness of the legislative branch of government in the 50 states and the U.S. territories. They do good work. Please welcome them to our Capitol. There they are. Members, let us also wish happy birthday to Assemblymember Davies, who is celebrating tomorrow. Happy birthday, Assemblymember. Moving to business on the daily file, Governor's veto passed and retained on file item one. Item number 2 is a notice. Under reconsideration, all items shall be continued. Moving to Assembly third reading. Without objection, we will take up file item 9, ACR 135. Clerk will read.
Assembly Concurrent Resolution 135 by Assemblymember Weber and others relative to state government.
Assemblymember Weber, you may open on the resolution.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise today to present ACR 135, which affirms the findings of the California Reparations Task Force in regards to the harms done to Black Californians over the course of California's history. The California Reparations Task Force was created through AB 3121 in 2020, authored by now Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber. Its purpose was to study the institution of slavery and its lingering negative effects on living African Americans, as well as develop reparation proposals for African Americans in California. AB 3121 also charged the California Department of Justice with providing administrative, technical, and legal assistance. The members of the Reparation Task Force, along with the Attorney General, released their report last June. We all know that the initial wealth of this country was built on the back of enslaved and trafficked African people. We all know that the history of exploitation, murder, abuse, and terror that the descendants of those enslaved from Africa have endured. But what we do not know is the role that California played. Because very few of us can that have an pro-slavery individuals held a great deal of power and that shaped state legislature would pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery in California, created new badges and incidents, which, as report revealed, have created norms which have impacted Black Californians. I'll tell you about a man named Bill Campbell. Campbell is a married woman named Mary Stevens. Unfortunately, what happened to Mr. Campbell in California was not an isolated event. In 1852, scholars estimated that up to 1,500 enslaved persons of African descent lived here in California. So yes, California did allow for slavery to exist within our borders. That same year in 1852, California passed and enforced the Fugitive Slave Law that made us more pro-slavery than most other free states. And here are some other examples of the harm that have occurred throughout California's 174-year history. In 1874, California Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools were legal, 22 years before U.S. Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. And today, California is the sixth most segregated state in the country for African American students. Operating under a state law for urban redevelopment, San Francisco declared that the predominantly Black neighborhood of Western Addition was blighted and therefore destroyed the Fillmore, San Francisco's most prominent African American neighborhood and business districts. The Ku Klux Klan was allowed to establish chapter all over the state, and many elected officials were members. In the 1920s in Los Angeles, the mayor, the district attorneys, and police officers were all members of this terrorist organization. Our state enacted policies to prevent Black Californians from living in certain neighborhoods, testifying against a white man in court, and from interracial marriage, just to name a few. If you haven't read the report, and I've said this so many times over the last few weeks, or at minimum, the executive summary, then I strongly encourage that you do. ACR 135 is not only a resolution to affirm the task force report, it is also meant to educate ourselves on California's history. Ida B. Wells states, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." The reparations task force turned the light of truth, and this is laid out in ACR 135. We cannot move forward as a state unless we learn about and acknowledge the harms of the past and begin to repair them. And ACR 135 is the first step in that acknowledgement. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Assemblymember Gibson, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and members. I proudly rise as a principal co-author of ACR 135, authored by my colleague from San Diego, Dr. Akilah Weber. I want to start off by making or saying a quote that I think is absolutely befitting for today's ACR 135. And it's my favorite drum major for justice, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he said this: the time is always right to do what is right. These words are true now as they were then. And the time to do right for our ancestors, slaves, is now. California, unfortunately, has had a history of not treating African Americans with respect and dignity in which they deserve. For example, California did not ratify the 15th Amendment until, watch this, 1962. Redlining, rampant, going through communities of color, redlining. Interracial marriages was not allowed until 1959, and the list continued to go on and on and on. We need to do better, and we can do better. That is why the California Legislative Black Caucus stands strong and boldly today in unity to introduce reparation bill package, which is just the beginning. And I wanted to underscore just the beginning. I personally have introduced Assembly Bill 2862, which will increase access to occupational licenses for our descendants of slaves. This will help combat the racial barriers and expand the opportunities for African Americans in this state. Our enslaved brothers and sisters are watching what we do. And I'm reminded of my great-grandmother, who was born as a child into slavery. You see, her parents were slaves in Texas, 2 miles from Galveston, Texas, East Texas. And so I remember every time we went to my great-grandmother's house, and we would say, "Mama, how you doing?" She said, "Baby, I'm feeling all right." Well, today I'm feeling all right, because today we can change the trajectory. We can rewrite the wrongs and change the wrongs that has taken place in California. And today, the California Legislative Black Caucus, we stand boldly, shoulder to shoulder, with no division and no pause today, asking our fellow brothers and sisters on this green carpet to support ACR 135. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Assemblymember Reyes, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative Latino Caucus in support of ACR 135. ACR 135 is a critical first step in work proposed by the Reparations Task Force by having the state of California formally acknowledge the harms and atrocities committed by the state of California in upholding the institution of slavery and forming systemic structures of discrimination. I would like to thank my colleague, Assemblymember Akilah Weber, for spearheading this resolution and recognize our Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, the author of AB 3121, which established the Reparations Task Force. I had the privilege of supporting ACR 135 in the Judiciary Committee last week. And I shared a memory of my father telling us, my siblings and I, about places where he would go here in California and see signs in restaurants that said, "No Negroes, no Mexicans, no dogs allowed." As ugly, as racist, and as uncomfortable as signs like that are, this is in fact part of California history. Our state openly restricted ways to build wealth by enacting policies that limited access to opportunities to start businesses and to own a home. The impacts of government-imposed segregation led to discriminatory housing policies such as redlining, restricted permitting, and loan practices for businesses and other mechanisms that have led to inequities still felt today and have stymied the American dream of generational wealth. Although both Latino and Black communities share a history of racial discrimination in this state, it is also important to speak to the impacts of racism uniquely felt by many African Americans. The fugitive slave laws enforced by the state of California were uniquely felt by African Americans, many of whom had fled slave states in search of freedom here in California. The highlighting and construction of monuments and memorials preserving Confederate culture and glorifying slavery have a very specific impact on African Americans here in California. Even in the Latino community, we have a history of colorism, anti-Blackness, and the subsequent mistreatment of our Afro-Latino brothers and sisters that we continue to reconcile with as a community. These impacts are part of the historic record and have been weaponized and perpetrated by the state of California, often with intention. Given these facts, it is critical that the state of California not only acknowledge this history, but acknowledge its responsibility to repair these wrongs. This is a historic day for the state of California, and fitting that we hear this on our floor during Black History Month. The Latino community, the Latino caucus, stands ready to ensure that we support and defend the civil rights and civil liberties of all and honor the lives and legacies of those named and unnamed whose lives were stolen by enslavement and other forms of state-sanctioned violence in California and throughout the US. In solidarity with the Legislative Black Caucus and Black Californians, the Latino caucus requests your aye vote on ACR 135.
Thank you, Assemblymember Reyes. Dr. Jackson, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus in support of ACR 135. Members, this resolution calls for the state of California to recognize its participation in the historic atrocities of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and specifically that state's participation in the fugitive slave law known as the Compromise of 1850. Many of us recognize California as a free state, but the elected officials in this body at one time approved the capture and return of Black people and sent them back from California back to southern states, not as humans, but as chattel and servants with no compensation, and more importantly, with no dignity, pride, or humanity. Members, I urge you to take a look at this reparations report. In it, you will find more atrocities, laws against Black people that you never knew existed. The report outlines many laws that discriminate in the areas of housing, separate and unequal education, racial terror, control of creative, cultural, and intellectual life, even racism in environmental and infrastructure development. The LGBTQ caucus stands in solidarity with African Americans and all historically oppressed people to ensure that they receive the appropriate acknowledgement, apology, and atonement from the state of California. It is simply the moral thing to do. But this resolution is only the first step toward the acknowledgement and the state accepting the responsibility for the harms that continue till this day. The descendants of slaves still suffers from poor education, poor economic vitality, and high incarceration. All of these can be traced back to the first acts that California has done to ensure that these outcomes became a reality. Therefore, because of the sins of this state's forefathers, the LGBTQ community will stand shoulder to shoulder until California atones and repairs these human rights violations. The LGBTQ caucus asks this body to begin this journey today and vote aye for reparations for the African American community and aye for ACR 135.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Assemblymember McKinner, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of ACR 135. To the Assembly member from San Diego, I want to thank you for authoring ACR 135 and for bringing this resolution forward as a part of the California Legislative Black Caucus Reparation Legislative Package. As you know, this is the first of what will be a multi-year effort to address the negative legacies and impacts from slavery to the harm that caused not just to enslaved persons, but to the descendants of enslaved persons, harms that continue to this day. Dr. Weber, our ancestor could never imagine us sitting in this chamber, in these chairs, in this building. You, the descendant of formerly enslaved people and sharecroppers from Arkansas, and me, a descendant of formerly enslaved people and sharecroppers from Orange, Texas. As a Black woman, we carry the weight of many burdens and traumas from generations past on our shoulders and on our crowns. And yet we stand with our chins up, our shoulders back, showing the strength and resilience of our people. Following the end of apartheid in South Africa, that nation formed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a public effort to speak truth to the horrors of apartheid, to allow those government to take responsibility for their actions and to allow for the public to heal. ACR 135 recognizes that while the state of California was not directly involved in the slave trade, the state and its people had a direct financial benefits from the slavery in the form of free labor, cheap agricultural products, cheap textiles, and was a model for our own labor exploitation here in the Golden State. As we begin the journey to repair the harm caused by slavery, it makes sense that we start by accepting responsibility for those in power that promoted discrimination and those that developed systemic structures of discrimination that still remain to this day. The journey ahead will not be easy, but I am proud to be working with the members of the State Assembly, the State Senate, and our governor. I am proud to stand shoulder to shoulder, crown to crown, to ensure that all descendants of slavery are granted the dignity and justice they deserve. And I ask for your aye vote on ACR 135. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember McKinner. Assemblymember Bonta, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speakers and esteemed colleagues of the Assembly. Today, as a proud Black Latina representing the vibrant communities of Oakland, Alameda, and Emeryville, I rise in unwavering support of ACR 135. California's history is complex, to say the least, and marred by grave injustices inflicted upon African Americans. Despite the abolition of slavery upon our state's inception into the Union in 1850, systemic oppression has persisted due to our failure to enforce this provision in total. From denying fundamental liberties to establishing insurmountable racial barriers, our state's history bears the scars and the hurt of discriminatory practices that have deeply wounded the African American community throughout the state of California. We have to acknowledge collectively how these past injustices continue to reverberate through our lived experiences every day through today. Discriminatory housing policies, segregation laws, unjust zoning ordinances have entrenched housing segregation and economic disparities among Black Californians. Black Californians continue to endure discrimination in healthcare, facing inaccurate diagnoses and a lack of cultural competent services. The impact of this is felt in every city. In a city like Oakland, where 40,000 African Americans have been displaced because of discriminatory practices, because we built highways as a policy through our community, because we decimated thriving centers of commerce, of Black commerce in our city, we have lost and we have been displaced. It is incumbent upon us as representatives of the people to recognize and accept responsibility for the harms and atrocities committed against our communities. Today, we proudly affirm our commitment to protecting the descendants of enslaved people and upholding the civil, political, and sociocultural rights of Black Californians. Let us stand united in this pivotal moment, acknowledging the painful truths of our history and committing ourselves to more meaningful action in support of our communities, because that will lead to repair and ultimately will lead to the healing that we need. For these reasons, colleagues, I respectfully join the Assembly member from San Diego County in asking for your aye vote on ACR 135.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bonta. Assemblymember Bryan, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I rise in strong support of ACR 135, and I want to thank my colleague from San Diego for authoring this resolution and for her powerful words. It's a profound Black History Month here on this Assembly floor. We established the nation's first reparations task force as a state. We should be proud of that. And they spent nearly 2 years documenting California's role in slavery and the promotion of slavery through both passive and active action. We know the impact of slavery on our country. Centuries, 13 generations lost, more people died than we can count. We know that. But we also know here in California, this body passed the most draconian fugitive slave law anywhere in the country. If you came to California seeking freedom and you were a descendant of slaves, you were denied that freedom. You were captured and you were taken back into enslavement. If you moved here owning your slaves and you wanted to keep owning them in California, you were allowed to do that as well. In contemporary times, we've seen the afterlives of slavery manifest our policy conversations even today. The freeway splitting that destroyed Black business industries and highways of commerce, destroyed Black communities. We've seen the public framework for private capital movement that's denied Black people home ownership and capital acquisition. We've seen a criminal legal system that still operates under a principle that's still found in our state constitution, that is slavery, still in the California Constitution. We have seen private land takings from Section 14. If you haven't heard about it, it's a place in Palm Springs where Black folks lived until their homes were burned and they were pushed out of there. Bruce's Beach, which I'm proud to say we returned here in the legislature, but these takings happened all across the state. It's not a surprise that we see the achievement gaps in an education system that we segregated before Plessy v. Ferguson. It's not a surprise we see Black home ownership rates so low. It's not a surprise we see tens of thousands of people in our cities sleeping on the streets who disproportionately look like the members who are standing up right now. Those are the afterlives of slavery. That is California's role in slavery. And if we are going to do our job effectively, we have to legislate to that. We have to speak to that. We've got to address these problems at the root, and this resolution lays out that root cause. I strongly ask for your support.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bryan. Assemblymember Gabriel, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus in strong support of ACR 135. I want to thank our colleague from San Diego for authoring this resolution. I want to thank all of the members of the California Legislative Black Caucus for their extraordinary leadership over the past couple of years on this important issue, and frankly, for giving all of us the incredible privilege to be part of this journey. I was reflecting on the fact that as we think about this effort, and we think about the solidarity that all of us have an obligation to pledge as part of this effort, if our country can't honestly, and our state can't honestly grapple with its history, and can't honestly grapple with the legacy of that history that our colleague from Los Angeles spoke about, then we can never hope to change the future. And we can never hope to achieve true justice. We heard about what happened in South Africa. We know what happened in Germany after the Nazis. We know about other nations that have honestly grappled with their past, that have thought about them and then committed themselves from that truth to advance justice and to advance peace and to advance the changes that are necessary. So I am really honored to be able to play a role in taking part of this acceptance of collective responsibility. I do think it's worth sharing a note for some Californians out there who might say, my family wasn't here in California during the period of slavery, so why should I take responsibility for this? And I will say, as someone whose family was not in California during a period of slavery, we all have an obligation because this is an act of collective responsibility. And when you have the privilege of coming, when my family had the privilege of coming to the state, of coming to this nation, of enjoying the privileges of citizenship, the privileges of residency, all of the bounty that comes with that, I think as part of that transaction, you accept the collective responsibility for the official actions that were taken in this body and by this state. And so no matter where your family lived during slavery, no matter where your family lived during Jim Crow, whether you were a Californian or not, if you are a resident in this state today, and particularly if you are a member of this body, then I would argue we have a solemn obligation to accept that collective responsibility. And I want to thank our colleague from San Bernardino who highlighted the unique experiences of Black Californians and the descendants of slavery. A lot of us come from communities that bring our own traumas into this body. We relate to the experiences of other communities through our own perspective. But it is important that we are honest about the fact that there is no experience that compares to the experience of Black Californians. That the way that this country and this state treated people as property is very, very different. And while all of those other traumas that all of our communities that bring are real and serious and deserving of acknowledgement, and we talked about that a little bit about that last week, and deserving of repair, that this is a unique experience. And it's important that all of us who come from other communities that experience trauma acknowledge that. So I will end by quoting a hero of mine, a rabbi, Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King. And when talking about racism, he said, "Some are guilty, but all are responsible." And I've always believed that. Many of us in this room are not guilty, but we certainly are responsible. And it is time that we accept that collective responsibility. So on behalf of myself and the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, respectfully question, I vote on ACR 135.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriel. Mr. Marisucci, you are recognized.
Thank you very much. I rise in solidarity with the Black Caucus in support of this important ACR. You heard me talking last week about how our country acknowledged the wrongs that it committed and passed reparations for Japanese Americans. What I didn't talk about last week was that reparations for Japanese Americans was the culmination of decades of grassroots advocacy in the community. I see so many parallels between the leadership of the Black Caucus in the California legislature and what we did in the Japanese American community in passing reparations for Japanese Americans. We started with a fact-finding commission, a congressional fact-finding commission that issued a lengthy report that established the factual basis for reparations. It established all of the historical harms, the historical trauma that our nation committed against Japanese Americans during World War II. I also did not mention last week, but I mention now that in that journey toward reparations for Japanese Americans that so many of the leaders in that effort were Black Americans. One of the first bills calling for reparations for Japanese Americans was Congressman Mervyn Dimely, because he represented Gardena, then one of the largest populations of Japanese Americans in the United States of America. Congressman Dimely was one of the first to introduce a bill calling for reparations for Japanese Americans. The Reverend Jesse Jackson was the first candidate for the President of the United States who called for reparations for Japanese Americans. And that helped elevate in the 1984 elections, that helped elevate the national profile of the call for reparations for Japanese Americans. And so I want to make sure that we all know that this is a collective fight to recognize, our nation and our state's history of racism and how to recognize that, come to terms with it, and to take responsibility for it. And so for those reasons, I rise in strong support of this resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Murtsuchi. Mr. Jones Sawyer, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make sure that people really understood what Dr. Shirley Weber did 2 years ago. The genius of putting together a task force that, one, put together a 400-page report to tell you why we needed reparations, and then to follow up with a 1,200-page report for what those reparations should be. And it's not only ironic that Dr. Aquila Weber is now here on this floor doing the exact same thing, setting the stage for why we need reparations here in California. But I also want to let you know, besides Mr. State Senator Steve Bradford and myself serving on that committee for 2 long years, putting together those 2 reports, I wanted to make sure I mentioned on this floor those other 7 people who took the time out of their busy schedule, out of their lives, dedicated everything to get this done, who received threats that were called names, that went through all sorts of things to put this together. And that was Dr. Cheryl Grills, Attorney Lisa Holder, Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, Councilwoman Monica Montgomery Stepp, Attorney Don K. Tamaki, Reverend Amos C. Brown, and Attorney Camilla Moore. And I also want to thank the attorneys, our attorneys, Attorney General Rob Bonta's staff, who put that document together, that I would put that document up against any other document that you've ever read. No one has been able to put shame to either one of those documents. And I believe they belong to the Smithsonian Institute. These documents are your documents. These documents came from this body, and we should ultimately be proud of it. And then for all the witnesses, all the experts that came before us during those 2 years, that put in their lifeblood to make sure that document not only had life into it, but breathe to us here on this floor why we need reparations. But most important, if any of you had ever been to any of those hearings, you would have heard all of our ancestors, all African-American ancestors that go all the way back to slavery and even to Africa. You could hear those souls come through the floor into that hearing room, through those mics, through those individual souls, describing the pain that they went through. And you would understand why this is so, so important. And think about it. They tried this on a national level. They didn't get this far. They tried this in other states. They didn't get this far. They tried this in other cities. They haven't gotten as far as where we are. We are the trendsetters, but most important, we're leading the way, and people are watching us, waiting for us to take that next step to ensure that we right this wrong, that it was long, long, long overdue. And so I ask every member of this body to vote for ACA 135 Weber, because the blood, sweat, and tear that's gone into this document to make this happen, for what you heard right now, was just a microcosm of the entire report that Dr. Akilah Weber read. If you just read just a little bit of that document, you would understand how important this is, not only to African Americans, but to everybody in this room that has been aggrieved. This is a blueprint for you to achieve your own reparations. So this is reparations, not just for African Americans, it's a reparations for all.
Thank you, Mr. Jones Sawyer. Mr. McCarty, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm, proud to get up and support ACR 135. I'm also proud this is my 10th year as an Assembly member celebrating Black History Month, and I think this is our most impactful one. And I'm also proud that there are 10 of us, the largest number in the Assembly of Black leaders, stepping up and recognizing our history, but charting a path going forward. This policy and the dozen plus measures that our colleague from Carson alluded to is really significant. We do a great job focusing on history in this legislature, in our schools. We don't always focus on action. We've had our moments, but too often I think we would say we tinker around the edges. We've stepped up on education and civil rights and police reform, but always around the edges, never asking the big questions. And these issues are personal for all of us. I think about my parents. Many of you know I'm a biracial African-American man. My parents met a couple years after the decision, which allowed them to legally marry. They wouldn't be allowed to legally marry. I think about my grandfather, Leon McCarty, who fled Louisiana as a 19-year-old during Reconstruction and came west to California for a better life, ironically. Here's where we are today. I think about my great-grandfather, Nelson McCarty, born in Winfield, Louisiana. He was born a slave in 1860. I think what he would think about all of us talking about these issues today, because it is our moment to not just tinker around the edges, but to acknowledge, apologize, and act. There are so many issues that we're working on. I'm proud that I'm going to be stepping up, working on education. As many of you know, this May is the 70th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, to make sure that equality in education. It says that in that Supreme Court document, but we know it's not true. We know the outcomes are very, very vastly different for Black kids across California. We know we're first in our homeless camps, percentage-wise, our criminal justice systems, county jails and state prisons, but economic mobility, education, we lag behind. This is our moment to act. And some would say, it's a tough time. We're in a budget deficit. Whether we're in a budget deficit or $100 billion budget surplus, what's right is right, and righting wrongs is always right. So I would ask all 120 of us in the legislature, 80 of us on this floor, to think about what we're asking you, to lean in and think about the impact of this 400 pages, but 404 years of history after we came and landed in Mayflower. And this is our time to step it up, state of California. Respectfully ask for your aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCarty. Mr. Holden, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I have to also acknowledge what I would consider an incredible alignment in time to have Dr. Akilah Weber from San Diego standing in the seat right next to the seat that her mother sat in when she was a member of this body. And so I join with my colleague from Los Angeles to say that Dr. Shirley Weber created a ripple in the water. And the daughter was able to step forward along with many others of this caucus and in this assembly body to recognize the timing, and the timing being now. I can tell you that when I reflect on the first African that was taken from Africa and brought to America. That created a ripple in time that impacted on generations yet born that now lead to a time such as this. So for not just the California Legislative Black Caucus, but for every member of this legislative body, this is an important time in history, not just for California, although we are here to talk about what is about repairing damage to those who were impacted by slavery in California, but also a ripple that goes across the country today, across the world. And embarking on discussions about reparation, our starting point must be a genuine apology. It's crucial to acknowledge and resonate with the sincerity owed to those who have endured historic injustices. This sets the tone for meaningful and respectful conversations on reparations. Our journey towards repair is ignited by an unapologetic commitment to truth, courageous embrace of the painful realities of the past, and an unwavering determination to scope a future where justice and equality prevail. The California Legislative Black Caucus represents over 2 million Black Californians and countless more across the nation. We don't just bear the responsibility, we embrace it as a solemn duty. It is a torch we carry, paving the way for generations to come. ACR 135 serves as the inaugural step in an impactful series of policies dedicated to unraveling centuries of oppression, and I urge your aye vote on ACR 135.
Thank you, Mr. Holden. Mr. Asali, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in condemnation of racial discrimination and the despicable, indefensible treatment of Black Californians in our state's early years. But I also rise as a proud Californian, and I believe that despite the bleak history of our early days, our state has often been at the forefront of the fight for racial equality. California, through landmark cases like Mendez versus Westminster School District in 1946 and Perez versus Sharp in 1948, paved the way for national decisions that struck down racist policies. The decision in Mendez versus Westminster led directly to the repeal of California's last school segregation statutes by the legislature in 1947, making our state the first in the nation to end segregation and setting the ground for Brown versus Board of Education. Similarly, the holding by the Supreme Court in Perez versus Sharp was the first decision by any state to permanently strike down an interracial marriage ban as a violation of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That was 19 years before the Supreme Court's decision in Loving versus Virginia. This legislature also led the way with California's Fair Employment and Housing Act of 1959, which predated the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, and mental physical disabilities. Yes, there's work to be done, but California's made substantial strides in the pursuit of racial equality. So I say yes, let us acknowledge and learn from our past wrongs, but also let us celebrate the progress towards equality we have made and reaffirm the principles upon which this country was founded, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that men and women are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let us reaffirm that and let us continue working towards equality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Asali. Ms. Bauer-Cahan, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in proud support of ACR 135. I too had the privilege of hearing the presentation last week in Judiciary of this bill, and it brought to mind a lot of what it means to be a lifelong Californian. And yes, this state has a lot to be proud of.
That's a fact I think all of us recognize. That does not make up for the wrongs of our history. And I think the critical piece of understanding that we need to bring to bear today is that those wrongs live on today, that they are not just our history, but they are our present. And I told this story in judiciary, but I think it's important that I repeat it here today. When I moved to the beautiful town of Orinda, where I live now, my husband and I were buying our home to raise our family. Couldn't have been happier. I'm signing the paperwork, and I turn the page, and in it is the document, the historical document, that said that I would not have been able to own my home because Jews were redlined out of the community, and African Americans too wouldn't have been able to buy the home. I was taken aback. I know it's not legally enforceable, but it sat there in the paperwork, which a few years ago, our colleague from Sacramento removed from the documents. And I went to him and I said, I think it was important that I saw that document, that I remembered the history of my neighborhood. Because just a few years later, my little one was in elementary school and he came home from an day when they were studying each other's ancestors and their family history. And he says to me, Mom, you know what's crazy? Everyone in my class is from just 2 continents. Can you believe that? Yeah, I can believe that. Because although those laws and that document is no longer legally enforceable, the remnants of that history are alive in my community today. We are underrepresented. We are underrepresented in terms of African Americans living in my community, Hispanic individuals living in my community, because they weren't allowed to live there. And so yes, today they can buy those homes, but they don't have the ability to, because those homes are passed down generation to generation amongst the white people who could buy them generations ago. And so it isn't just the redlining is in our past, it is in our present. And that is what we must understand, acknowledge, and repair, because our future should be a just and equitable one. And I dream in my lifetime that will be true, but we are so far from that today. And this is just the beginning of the work that we need to do. With that, I respectfully ask for an aye vote on ACR 135.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bauer-Cahan. Assemblymember Wilson, you are recognized.
Members, I rise today to support ACR 135 as a principal co-author and also chair of the Legislative Black Caucus. And I want to be very clear, very clear. I rise to celebrate California for the progress that it's made, that 10 Black individuals sit and stand on this floor proudly representing districts that are not traditionally Black, that are the most diverse in our history, that the Black community didn't send us, but the community sent us to do what is right, to celebrate all the great things about California and expand on that, but also to acknowledge the harm that has been done to every Californian, to every vulnerable population, to every disadvantaged neighborhood, and do what is right. Today, as we stand on this floor in honor of Black History Month and the contributions that the Black community has made to not only California, but to Americans' history, to stand on this floor as a country that we built, but still yet to seem as a footstool, we stand here proudly asking every single one of our colleagues, 80 on this floor, 40 in the Senate floor, to say, stand in solidarity with us and acknowledge the harms. Acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the suffering, and say that from this point forward, no matter what we've done in the past, but from this point forward, every decision, every policy, every legislative priority or budget priority will be in pursuit of all Californians, even the least among us, and even those that call themselves Black Californians. That is why I, Lori Wilson, hailing from the great district of the 11th district of Solano County, which has the highest percentage of Black folks in our great state, ask for your support on ACR 135.
Thank you, Assemblymember Wilson. Seeing and hearing no further debate, Dr. Weber, would you like to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by thanking everyone who spoke today in solidarity. Your support is definitely felt and very much appreciated. You know, when California's Supreme Court affirmed that it would not allow Black witnesses to testify against white Californians, it did so because, quote, if they allowed them to testify, it, quote, admit them to all the equal rights of citizenship, and we might soon see them at the polls, in the jury box, up on the bench, and even in our legislative halls. The 12 members of the California Legislative Black Caucus sitting at these desks in both houses are truly their worst nightmares. Some would say that we've come a very long way. And yes, we are definitely not where we were. You know, California engaged in some of the same type of voter suppression often seen in the South by implementing the poll tax, the literacy tax. And today, the person who is in charge of California's elections is a descendant of African slaves. So yes, we have made some progress. However, we still see the ramifications of these badges of slavery in our education system, where African American students are consistently score lower than other groups, in our criminal justice system, where African Americans are incarcerated more and longer sentences than others, in our healthcare system, where we see shortened life expectancy for African Americans. We have worsened maternal morbidity and mortality rates despite our socioeconomic status. We see these badges in our economic system, where we have less home ownership, less generational wealth, less earning potential. In our social service systems, where African American children make up 6% of California population, but 22% of the children in foster care. And I could go on. We must do better. We must repair these harms and finally eliminate these badges of slavery in our great state. And that begins with the education and affirmation about our state's history and the role that our state played in the human rights violation and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants. This is ACR 135, an affirmation of those findings. And now that we know better, we know we must do better. Before I conclude, I also want to thank the members of the Reparation Task Force, Attorney General Rob Bonta, and the staff that researched and worked on this groundbreaking report. And finally, I have to give thanks to our Secretary of State, my mother, Dr. Shirley Weber, for introducing AB 3121, which allowed us to be here today to once again make history and show the rest of the United States how to move on a path to progression. And with that, I respectfully ask for your aye vote and request that the first roll be open for co-authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. All debate having ceased, the clerk will open the roll for co-authors. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote for co-authors. Clerk will close the roll. There are 58 co-authors added. Members, we will take a roll call on this resolution. Clerk will open the roll. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll and tally the vote. There are ayes 57, no 0. The resolution is adopted.
Members, oh, is it on? Members, we will now move for my 12th and last observance of Black History Month. Without objection, we will now take up file item 6, ACR 136 Holden, The clerk will read.
Assembly Concurrent Resolution 136 by Assemblymember Holden and others relative to Black History Month.
Assemblymember Holden, you may open on the measure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Today I rise to present Assembly Concurrent Resolution 136, a California Legislative Black Caucus priority bill that recognizes February 2024 as Black History Month and encourages everyone to celebrate the accomplishments of African Americans. In this moment of reflection during Black History Month, we embark on a journey through the tapestry of African American history, a story woven with threads of resilience, courage, and triumph. From the arrival of the first Africans in 1619 to the present day, African Americans have played an integral role in shaping the narrative of our nation. We stand on the shoulders of giants such as Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the visionary behind Negro History Week in 1926, now celebrated as Black History Month since 1976. As we celebrate the achievements across various fields, from science and medicine to politics and education, we must acknowledge the persistent challenges before us. Racial and social injustice, voter suppression, and economic disparities persist, demanding our collective attention and action. As we recognize Black History Month in 2024, let us not only celebrate the achievements of African Americans, but also commit ourselves to dismantling the barriers that persist. Together, let us create a future where every American, regardless of their background, can thrive and contribute to the continued success and prosperity of our great nation. I thank you, and I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Holden. Mr. Rodriguez, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise today on behalf of the California Latino Legislative Caucus to support ACR 136. I would like to thank Assembly Member from Pasadena for spearheading this important resolution. During Black History Month, we honor the rich and diverse experiences of Black people in California and our country. Afro-Latino, Black Latinos play a crucial role in the makeup of the Latino and Black American identity. Afro-Latinos have made significant contributions in various fields, including literature, social innovation, performance arts, music, and academia, shaping this country's rich history. The diversity of the California Latino Legislative Caucus includes two of my colleagues, whom we are honored to work amongst, Assemblymember Mia Banta and our Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman. Our Latino identities are multidimensional and multifaceted. We embrace and celebrate our unique racial identities, which bring a rich and diverse perspective to every aspect of American life. We celebrate the legacy of Black Americans who, with their fight and determination, have redefined our democracy into a fair and equitable society. We owe a debt of gratitude to our fellow Black brothers and sisters whose struggles for freedom, equal treatment, and the right to vote paved the way not only for themselves, but also for the Latino community, immigrants, and other historically marginalized communities. Their fight for equal opportunities in education, housing, and the workplace, economic opportunity, equal justice, and political representation has significantly impacted the world. In fact, the farm worker movement's success was also in part due to their collaborations with the Black Panther Party and their activism in Oakland. Their common goal of systemic change brought them together, leading to a productive partnership that helped drive their efforts forward. Their successes of multiracial coalitions between the farm worker movement and the Black Panther Party serves as a reminder of the importance of collaboration and solidarity in achieving systemic change. On this month and always, let us honor the work created through much sacrifice to advance more fair and inclusive communities, to rectify past injustices and ensure that every individual is judged solely based on their character. Let us take inspiration from the legacy of Black Americans to strive to build a world where every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their skin color, their gender or social orientation, their background or circumstances. Thank you, colleagues. I respectfully ask for aye vote on ACR 136. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as the Vice Chair of the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus in support of ACR 136, commemorating Black History Month. Today, we honor the contribution and the voices of the Black community in our nation's past, present, and future Black lives, many of whom fought for some of the rights that we have today. The Black community and its leaders have been at the forefront of social justice movements since the inception of our country. We understand that Black activism has so often been born out of necessity so that Black people can live and thrive in a nation built by their ancestors. We seek to honor Black leaders whose excellence and drive have bent the arc of the moral universe towards justice. From the inception of the Stonewall Uprising led by Marsha P. Johnson, to the push for national civil and voting rights orchestrated by Bayard Rustin, and to leading the global fight against HIV and AIDS by Phil Wilson. These are but a few of the exceptional Black trailblazers who have used intersectionality as a tool to affirm what we have already known to be true. The Black community has strength and purpose and must be included and valued wherever decisions are being made. We have none other to thank than those Black LGBTQ trailblazers who have stood firm in their identities as they have led the charge to seek true equality and justice for all. Staging sit-ins to protest the denial of services to LGBTQ people and dressing and clothing that did not, quote unquote, align with society's gender standards were but a few of the peaceful protest tactics that LGBTQ rights leaders borrowed from the civil rights movement to tip the scales towards justice for our community. Additionally, many of the major legal gains that the LGBTQ community are also in part due to arguments developed by Black civil rights lawyers, such as securing marriage equality in Obergefell v. Hodges due to the foundational ruling of Loving v. Virginia. While there are those who wish to ban books teaching of our inseparable history, we must continue the pushback and encourage people to educate themselves on these critical facts of history in order to further demonstrate our allyship and our interconnectedness. As the Vice Chair of the Legislative California LGBTQ Caucus, I would like to thank the leaders of the California Legislative Black Caucus for bringing forward this important resolution and respectfully ask for your aye vote on ACR 136.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. You are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in support of ACR 136 as on behalf of the Republican caucus. And it is so important today that we recognize the great contributions and that we recognize Black History Month. And part of that is recognizing certainly the terrible history of discrimination that has occurred in our state and in our country. But it's also in recognizing the amazing leaders and the historical figures, Black Americans, who were trailblazers. And two that come to mind for me, first is James Beckworth, who was an amazing trailblazer, who had some amazing adventures. We talk a lot about the history of settlement and coming out to California and the gold rush and all of those things. Well, James Beckworth was one of those people who trailblazed, set the trails to come to California. He doesn't get talked about a lot in the history because of prejudice, because of discrimination. He was an African American. He was an excellent marksman. He was an excellent outdoorsman. And he is the reason that so many people were able to eventually come to California because he had been one of those people who was a trailblazer. And I think that's a symbol for how many leaders in the African American community have been trailblazers, who have stood up for what is right and who have reminded Americans of human dignity and the right path forward. James P. Beckworth was one of those individuals. Another one that I think of is Edward Duplex, who many people maybe don't know was the first African-American mayor in California. He was the mayor of a small town in my district called Wheatland, California. He owned the barber shop. California was a place of opportunity for him. He was able to come here and establish that business and eventually became the mayor of Wheatland, California. That's a proud history, but it's one that often, unfortunately, is not learned. And that is why it is so important that we celebrate Black History Month and that we commit to helping ensure our young people know the history, know all of the history, right? The dark parts and the good parts and talk about all of the people that are part of this history of California. And so today I proudly rise in support of this resolution, and may we continue that great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the Native American Legislative Caucus. I rise to join in commemorating Black History Month in ACR 136. The consequences of those 246 years of slavery and 100 years of segregation still plague African Americans today, and indeed plagues all Americans today. A history of trauma that still needs to come to light to make sure that we can overcome and start the healing process, not only in our nation, but here also in the state of California. During those times of slavery, bondage, and oppression, many African Americans fled that type of treatment to find solitude with Native American tribes in those areas. We share that common thread in this nation's building. But what the nation hasn't done is come to terms with this historic past, his horrid past towards the treatment of people. We have to be able to stand together as one together. It was said earlier that just because wording says all men are created equal does not make it so. We still have laws that show that people weren't treated equal. That's why we're here today, to stand up for ACR 136, to make sure that that treatment towards its people, the nation's people, is something that continues to move forward. We stand in solidarity side by side in honoring Black History Month. But let's also stand side by side to ensure the true history, the true injustices continue to move forward here in the state of California through the history books and the treatment of all people. I stand in solidarity with our African American brothers and sisters to stand together and honor ACR 136.
Ms. Waldron, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Black History Month provides a dedicated time to recognize and celebrate the rich history, culture, and contributions of the African American community, including the remarkable achievement of Black women. And I'd like to speak a little bit to that. Black women have played pivotal roles throughout history, often facing unique challenges and overcoming adversity. Their stories deserve attention to provide a more comprehensive understanding of our shared history. Many Black women have been at the forefront of social and political movements, advocating for justice, equality, and human rights. Folks like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born in 1825, was an abolitionist, a suffragist, and a poet. The first woman instructor at Union Seminary in Ohio. She was active in the Underground Railroad. Sojourner Truth, born in 1883, was a former slave who became an outspoken advocate for abolition and civil and women's rights in the 19th century. She was the first mother to go to court and win her case to recover her son who had been taken from her. Ida B. Wells Barnett, born in 1862, was an African-American journalist and activist who led an anti-lynching crusade in the United States in the 1890s. She also fought for women's suffrage. She wrote the pamphlet sponsored by Frederick Douglass to attack the exclusion of Black people from Chicago's World's Fair. Nannie Helen Burroughs, born in 1879, was an educator, suffragist, and civil rights activist. She founded the nation's training school for women and girls. Black History Month challenges and breaks down stereotypes about the roles and capabilities of Black women. It highlights their accomplishments in various fields, from literature and music to film and visual arts, science and technology, and creativity and achievements that have enriched our global cultural heritage. Today, we will recognize several leaders in the Black community during our floor session. Recognizing their leadership helps acknowledge the ongoing fight for a more just and inclusive society. I urge your aye vote on ACR 136. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Friedman, you're acknowledged to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members.
On behalf of the Legislative Jewish Caucus, I rise in strong support of ACR 136, designating February as Black History Month. As we all continue to fight towards a more just future, we of course have to do so much more to ensure that our country continues to honor the contributions of Black Americans every single day of the year, and not just in February. Influential Black leaders have paved the way towards equality and justice and continue to chart our future. Our Black siblings really do represent the Jewish proverb that says, "Justice, justice, you shall pursue." Now, there are, of course, prominent African Americans that we all think of every single day. People like President Obama and Ray Charles and Martin Luther King. And of course, there are Black women who are also household names like Oprah Winfrey and Rosa Parks and Kamala Harris, and to many of us, Dr. Shirley Weber. Clearly, given the difficulties that African Americans have faced in this country that we heard so much about as we discussed the last ACA, it should be clear to everybody that these individuals weren't just as good as their white colleagues. The men had to be at least twice as good, and the women, I'd say 4 times as brilliant and strong to achieve what they did. And there are so many more African Americans that have left a mark on our state and on our nation that have changed the course of history, whose names we don't always hear. And we all have to work to make sure that those names are taught in our textbooks, that they are talked about around our dinner is so important. It's all of our responsibility to ensure that history remembers the great sacrifice of African Americans, their critical contributions in the face of the adversity, and of course the adversity that so many individuals continue to face every single day in this nation. Because unfortunately, despite how far we have all come, racism still poses considerable challenges. And Black History Month is here for us to reflect on our country's past and to remind us that we have so much more work to do. Now, I'm proud as a Jew of the contributions that Jewish Americans have made to support our African American brothers and sisters, from marching in the civil rights movement, marching alongside Dr. Martin Luther King, to being there to help give working Black Americans access to the protections of labor unions. We have been there for the fight and will continue to be there for the fight. But I also want to point out that in many cases, we are one community. And as the mother of an African American 10-year-old Jewish girl, whose best friend is an 11-year-old Black Jewish girl, we are the same. We are in many cases one and the same. So it is that spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood that I hope we all approach today. I want to bring up Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights leader who believed that no progressive social or political movement could develop in America without the continued close cooperation of the Black and Jewish communities. It is that pride in that struggle together and in that spirit on behalf of the Legislative Jewish Caucus that I request and I vote on ACR 136.
Assemblymember Monta, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of ACR 136, commemorating Black History Month on behalf of the California Legislative Women's Caucus. The story of Black History Month started with Dr. Carter Woodson. Dr. Woodson founded Negro History Week in 1926, which became Black History Month in 1976. Today, Black History Month has inspired communities throughout the country to organize local celebrations in honor of Black history and culture. As a Black Latina legislator, it gives me great pride to hold this position. We all know representation matters, and we hold these seats of power with grace and dignity. But I stand on the shoulders of phenomenal Black women who came before me. I know without the work of Black women, I wouldn't have this seat. It's critically important to celebrate these trailblazers, especially as we see states across the country trying to erase the history of Black Americans. So let's talk about some of our phenomenal women. Too many women come to mind, so I will only highlight a few. I think of Septima Clark, who developed citizenship schools. Her efforts helped African Americans access the ballot. She said, literacy means liberation. knowing that education was and is still the key to gaining political, social, and economic power. I think of Prathia Hall, an ordained Baptist minister and gifted orator. Her powerful prayer and calls for racial justice and equity inspired Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And let's talk about Carol Mosley Braun. She became the first female senator from Illinois and the first Black woman to serve in the US Senate. In the time she was in the Senate, she championed education bills and fought for our civil rights. I was so happy to witness in my lifetime the elevation of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the United States Supreme Court, the first Black woman of the United States Supreme Court, speaking truth to power in the highest court of the land. I certainly celebrate the female legislators who have come before us, including Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, the first African-American woman elected to this body, Dr. Shirley Weber, Holly Mitchell, and so many more. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our Barbara Lee, a groundbreaking leader in the state and on the national stage. I also want to shout out my sisters of the Black Caucus for their leadership and the hope they bring to their constituents. One thing always holds true. Our country was built on the backs and in the hearts of Black women and their efforts. That is why we should never underestimate their power, and we should honor the women in our lives and in our history every time we wield the right to vote, the right to assemble, and the right to speak. For these reasons, colleagues, I respectfully join the Assembly member, my colleague with honor from Pasadena, in asking for your aye votes on ACR 136.
Thank you. Now, seeing and hearing no further debate, Assemblymember Holden, you may close.
Thank you, members. And let me just say, I appreciate all of you who have arose today to describe, as was reflected on earlier, the intersectionality of Black history, Black community, on all of us. As a nation of people, the proverbs that says, African-American proverb that says, it takes a village. Colleagues, we are the village. I respectfully ask for your aye vote on ACR 136.
Would you like the first roll to be open for co-authors? All debate having ceased, the clerk will open the roll for co-authors. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Members, this is for co-authors. All members vote who desire to vote. The clerk will close the roll. There are 73 ayes, 73 co-authors. Without objection, we will now take a voice vote on the resolution. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. Members, today we celebrate Black History Month by recognizing unsung heroes from across the state. The California Legislative Black Caucus established the Unsung Hero Awards in honor of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to celebrate those who embody his philosophy and ideas. We continue our tradition with this distinguished group of individuals being honored today. Here to help us celebrate our former Assembly members, Elihu Harris. Could you stand, Elihu? Wake up. Sandre Swanson. And I believe he was in the room, Tony Thurman. I am appointing an escort committee to bring our honorees onto the floor for our ceremony. Members should retire to the rear of the chamber as I call your name. Assembly members Wilson, Bryan, Weber, Bonta, McKenna, McCarty, Holden, Gibson, and Jackson. I also request that Speaker Robert Rivas and Republican leader James Gallagher move to the front center aisle to receive our honorees. Members, it is now time to introduce and welcome our unsung heroes of 2024. The clerk will read.
Our first honoree is Michael Threets. He is escorted by Assemblymember Wilson. Michael Threets, a Fairfield-based librarian, gained fame for his viral social media videos showcasing book recommendations, library services, and uplifting messages. Michael is renowned for his contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Please welcome Michael Threets. Honoree Prophet Walker is escorted by Assemblymember Bryan. Prophet Walker is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Treehouse in Los Angeles. He is dedicated to uplifting his community and openly shares his experiences with poverty and the incarceration system. Please welcome Prophet Walker. Honoree Chris Jones is escorted by Assemblymember Weber. Chris Jones, a native southeastern San Diego, has always been deeply connected to his community. In 2009, he established the Young and Prosperous Foundation to ensure ongoing support for the local needs of youth. Please welcome Chris Jones. Honoree Kathy Adams is escorted by Assemblymember Bonta. Kathy Adams is the Chief Executive Officer of the national award-winning Oakland African American Chamber of Commerce and is the founding president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women of the Oakland Bay Area. Please welcome Kathy Adams. Honoree Carolyn Fowler is escorted by Assemblymember McKenna. Carolyn Fowler is a former AT&T executive who now serves as a government affairs advisor for Los Angeles Unified School District and is a dedicated member of the City of Inglewood Planning Commission. Please welcome Carolyn Fowler. Honoree Mervyn Brookins is escorted by Assemblymember McCarty. Mervyn Brookins of Sacramento is the founder and leader of Brother to Brother Mentoring, a nonprofit organization for at-risk youth, gang intervention, and prevention who uses personal stories for community improvement. Please welcome Mervyn Brookins. Honoree Dominique DePrima is escorted by Assemblymember Joan Sawyer. Dominique DePrima of South Los Angeles began her career as a rapper at age 13. She is now making history as the first African American woman to host a drive time talk radio show called First Things First. Please welcome Dominique DePrima. Honoree Leandra Kruger is escorted by Assemblymember Holden. Justice Leandra R. Kruger is a highly accomplished jurist appointed to the California Supreme Court in 2014. A native of the Los Angeles area, Justice Kruger earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard College and JD from Yale Law School. Please welcome Justice Leandra Kruger. Honoree Ayanna Davis is escorted by Assemblymember Gibson. Dr. Ayanna E. Davis, a lifelong resident of Compton, is passionate about equity and inclusion for young children in disadvantaged conditions and is the vice chair of the Compton Unified School District's Governing Board of Education. Please welcome Ayanna Davis. Honoree Kimberly Taylor is escorted by Assemblymember Jackson. Kimberly Taylor, a longtime Moreno Valley resident, spends her time advocating for youth. For the past 27 years, she has served in various roles within the Moreno Valley Unified School District. Please welcome Kimberly Taylor.
Yeah, and we have the honorees. The Senate's unsung heroes are also in the rear of the chamber. From Senator Stephen Bradford's district, please welcome Dr. Thomas Parham's wife, who's representing Dr. Thomas Parham. And from Senator Lola Smallwood Cuevas district, please welcome Fran Jamont. Did they leave? So again, on behalf of Chair Lori Wilson and the members of the California Legislative Black Caucus, thank you for helping us commemorate Black History Month and the contribution of Black Americans to our state and the nation. As a memento to mark today's ceremony, a copy of the book Multiplicity by Catherine Delmitz is on each member's desk. This book highlights 50 artists that reflect the breadth and complexity of Black identity. In addition, members and staff are invited to attend a reception in the Eureka Room from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. this afternoon to continue this celebration. This concludes the Assembly's observance of Black History Month. As our honorees exit the chambers, please join me in another round of applause for all of their contributions. You know what? And before we all leave, we have honored guests in the back, and the chair wanted me to make sure I acknowledge them. We have esteemed members from Los Angeles, from our city council. I'm gonna start from the council on up to the most important. The president of the council, Paul Krikorian, former member. Bob Blumenfeld, a former not employee, but assembly member. Eunices Hernandez. Hugo Soto Martinez. And of course, former speaker, former assembly member, Karen Mayer, Karen Bass. I'm so sorry. I didn't see you, Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez. I apologize. I think that's all for me.
SB 490, introduced by Senator Stephen Bradford, is the first legislation that will create the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency.
The CAFA agency is a recommendation from the California Reparations Task Force final report.
Possible offices within the agency could include genealogy, strategic communications, data research collection,
as well as general counsel with social services and family affairs.
Tell your representative to support the upcoming 2024 reparations legislation.
Find them at findyourrep.legislature.ca.gov.